about mandatory sentencing. Now, this week you might have heard the Mayor of the Gold Coast, Tom Tate, saying that mandatory sentencing for repeat juvenile offenders needs to happen. Lawyers and civil libertarians were upset about that, saying it's been demonstrated to be a failure in previous times. So what is the answer? I mean, the answer is clearly not to do nothing or to do more of the same. How can we make a difference in the problem of youth crime, which lots of places, particularly you might have heard around the Gold Coast and Ipswich, have seen particular problems with recently? Dr. Terry Goldsworthy is an associate professor in criminology at Bond University and a former detective inspector from Queensland Police with 28 years of policing experience. Dr. Goldsworthy, firstly, do we immediately chuck out the idea of mandatory sentencing, or does it have some merit?
Yeah, morning, Kate. I think, you need to consider what's being proposed. And I mean, I haven't seen the detail of what Mayor Tate is suggesting, but your comments around mandatory sentencing in general are quite accurate. I mean, if we go back to what is sentencing meant to achieve, there's a number of principles, and they are things like retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, incapacitation, denunciation, and restoring. So if you look at mandatory sentencing, it's probably going to tick retribution, incapacitation, and maybe deterrence, although there is scant evidence that mandatory sentencing actually acts as a deterrent. So you would need to see what is the mandatory sentencing regime being proposed for what offences, what engages it. We don't want, situations like happened up in Northern Territory. Some of the examples were a Indigenous woman, first-time offender, who got 14 days imprisonment for stealing a can of beer. I mean, those kind of outcomes are not what we want. So really depends how that mandatory sentencing is going to be put into place and implemented. Is it only for repeat offences? Is it only for certain types of offences? These are all the things that anyone putting forward the model will need to put forward in detail.
Do we have these suggestions of mandatory sentencing when we feel dissatisfied with the sentences being delivered by the judiciary?
Well, I think that does sometimes lead to it. When there's a sense of, helplessness, and that can be perceptions just as much as it is in reality. So, we know in Queensland that about 10% of juvenile offenders are responsible for somewhere around 45-50% of the crime. So we have a hardcore of juvenile offenders. Conversely, 50% of people who have a single interaction with the criminal justice system never come back into it. So we don't want to capture those people in any kind of mandatory sentencing regime. But, probably the hardcore would be the people that you would be looking at if you were going to put this in place. And some of the problems we have is that, perceptions are just as important as the reality of what is happening in terms of crime. So if the community is living in fear, it doesn't really matter whether that fear is justified or not. The fact is they're living in fear, and that's what we don't want the community to do. So these things will tend to rise up, and, it's easy when you're looking at a crime problem to go, let's just get tough, that'll fix it. Crime is much more complex than that.
So what are some of the solutions that do have evidence behind them that can help to reduce recidivism, or make sure that the people who commit the crimes don't do it again?
Well, you really need to go back and look at the causations, which are multifactorial for young people in terms of why they commit crime, or the situations that contribute to them committing crime. And they include things such as substance abuse. 80% of young offenders are abusing some kind of substance. It is quite common to be ice or other methamphetamines. There's an impact of domestic violence on young offenders at the home. Either they're subject to it or they may be committing it. You have mental health and behavioural disorders. In terms of those people, they're disengaged from education, from employment opportunities. They don't have adequate adult supervision. There's issues with their parents. About 30% of them have at least one parent who has spent time in custody, and they have unsuitable, or they don't have any kind of stable accommodation. So, if you have all those things going in the background, and someone doesn't see any way out of that, then they see their way out of it through a pathway of crime. So if you can address those issues, they will assist you in terms of the criminal justice system addressing the offending. I mean, you can't, you often hear the term arrest your way out of some problems. And I guess this is one of those problems where it's very resource intensive, it's expensive. I was reading some years ago, a journalist sent me a sentencing report on a young woman up in North Queensland who had a serious criminal history, but when she was engaged by these kind of services and was given food vouchers, was given somewhere to stay that was safe, etc., her offending stopped. Then the funding stopped and she went straight back to offending. So, I mean, it really is a complex issue.
It is, but to solve all of those things seems almost impossible. To solve issues of substance abuse, accommodation and housing issues, education issues and intergenerational trauma or offending. How do we begin to have any hope about doing that?
Well, I think you've just got to invest in it, Kate. You know, you've got to put the money in there. One of the issues was that there was no placement for this young woman. So, you need to invest in creating beds where young people can go and stay and be safe. I mean, it's going to cost money. It's not as perhaps as attractive as getting up there and go, well, we employed another 500 police, or we're going to introduce tough legislation. I mean, these things happen in the background. They're not as obvious. The public don't necessarily see them as an answer to crime issues. So that's where politicians need to get out and sell them rather than just relying on the let's get tough on crime approach, because that doesn't always succeed. And I guess the other thing in Queensland in particular is, we're overdue now for a review of the juvenile justice responses put in place almost 2 years ago now by the Labor government. Bob Atkinson was going to conduct a review of the things such as the bail tracking, the ankle trackers, the presumption against bail, etc., how those things have been working. That review hasn't come out yet, and it's now well overdue. I think we need to see how effective those responses have been first and then go from there.
Just to be clear, the report has been complete and it's sitting with government, is that right?
You might know more than me. The last I saw was that it had been delayed, and that was a report I saw, I think, in February this year. So, I mean, if the report has been completed, then, it needs to come out to the public so we can see what the outcomes are.
Thank you so much for speaking with us this morning.
Thanks, Kate.
Dr. Terry Goldsworthy, who is an Associate Professor in Criminology at Bond University, with experience in the police force, around 28 years of it. It's 16 minutes.
Call ABC Sport Daily. Find us on the ABC.